Um, welcome to tonight's Pension Board meeting. My name is Councillor Rory Vaughan, Chair of the committee. So just to remind people of a few housekeeping points, please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. First of all, please wait until I call you before speaking. And can I remind officers to introduce themselves when they first address the committee? So item number 1 is apologies for absence. I understand that no apologies for absence have been received. Amrita, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Secondly is item number 2, which is roll call and declarations of interest. So I will now do a roll call to confirm the members in attendance. So when called, please say present and note any declarations of interest. Councillor Kwan.
Present.
Neil Newton. Neil, I think you might be muted. I can see, but I can't hear. No, okay. Let's come back to that. William O'Connell.
Present.
And Khadija Sekon.
She was supposed to attend the meeting. I haven't received any apologies for absence.
Okay. I think Neil is actually, I can actually see Neil, but I haven't been able to hear him. Neil, are you there? Okay, well, I can see Neil Newton, so I think we can record him as being here. Hopefully we can hear from him later in the meeting. So item number 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Do members approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of January 2020? Is that agreed?
Agreed from me.
Agreed.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Those are agreed. Item number 4 is the draft minutes of the previous pension fund subcommittee. Now, I guess we could go on to them, but unfortunately, there's nothing we can necessarily say on them. But the draft minutes of the previous pension fund subcommittee. Do members note the minutes of the previous pension fund subcommittee held on the 29th of September 2020?
Yes, noted.
Noted. William, Neil, hopefully those are noted.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't present, but yeah.
Sure. I think some of the some of the points there will actually be raised in our agenda tonight. So, okay. So, senior officers have requested that agenda items 10, 11, and 12 be prioritised, as many of the officers who we've got a number in attendance tonight do not need to sit through the whole meeting. So, if you are, I'm certainly happy with this. So, I'm planning to go now to the exempt part of the agenda, which is item number 10, first of all. So item 10, I think we need to resolve first of all, and then we would go to the exempt part. So we're invited to resolve to go to under section 100 and 100A4 of the Local Government Act 1972, that press and public be excluded from the meeting during the consideration of the following items of business on the grounds that they contain likely disclosure of exempt information as defined. I won't read out the rest of it, but that was on the agenda tonight. So can we agree to go to the exempt business?
Agreed.
Great. Agreed. Okay. In which case, before we actually do that, so thank you very much. That's item 10. Before we go to that, can I just ask David to let me know that any observers have left the meeting. So we've only got people who are not excluded. So the pension fund. Now let me go back to my notes. So the pension fund quarterly update pack. Can I ask Timothy Mapufu to introduce this item?
Thank you, Chair. Just to check, am I coming across okay?
Yeah, we can see you, or I certainly can.
Right. Yes, so my name is Tim Mpofu, and I'm the pension fund manager for the fund. So I look after some of the day-to-day investment for the fund. So I just thought before I go into some of the updates that are contained in this quarterly update, I thought it'd be just worth giving a verbal update on what's happened during the course of the year. So I think it's worth highlighting that there have been quite a few changes to the investment strategy, which we've not been able to include in this report, but I will provide them to you just shortly verbally. So obviously, during the course of this year, there's been quite a lot of change that's happened. It's been particularly challenging, not only from the investment perspective, but operationally as well. So the pension subcommittee actually, under the advice from investment consultant and officers, has taken some steps to try and make sure that the fund is positioned correctly as we go into this recovery process, and hopefully to safeguard ourselves against the impacts of the COVID-19 virus. So earlier this year, the fund decided to allocate 15% of its overall investment portfolio to an equity manager. So the equity manager that was appointed is the London CIF, who manage a global sustained fund, which is looked after by the Morgan Stanley Fund. They were appointed over the summer, and we've now completed our investment to them, which is 15%. So it's about 160 million of the fund. One of the main factors for this appointment was that the subcommittee was actually impressed by Morgan Stanley's investment process, and particularly how they integrate ESG as part of its investment processes. So one of the key aspects is that they actually have an exclusionary process. So they exclude from tobacco and fossil fuels and gambling and alcohol and the various other factors. But this fund is also 80% less than the main index in terms of its carbon footprint. So that was also seen as a positive, considering all the goals that the fund has to be carbon neutral by 2030. So that was one of the main sort of moves that we've made to just make sure that we're able to take advantage of those opportunities as the fund starts readjusting in this new environment. And then another one that's actually linked directly to what's happening in terms of like the global economy has been to change the allocation, which was on the Inflation Protections Fund, which was currently run by M&G. That was about 10% of the portfolio. That's now been changed, and we're looking for a replacement at the moment. The pension fund next week actually will be looking at some of the options around that, and that will include the social housing and ground rents. And one of the main reasons why they came out this fund was because of its large exposure to long lease property, and as you know, with the impact that COVID-19 has had on the economy, this was particularly an area of concern and an area of risk. So we've decided to just shift that slightly, but still maintaining the inflation linkage the inflation linkage like allocation. So I think at this point, I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any questions on some of those factors I've just gone through. But if not, I'm happy to carry on to throughout the rest of the report.
Are there any questions from members?
No questions.
Timothy, I think you can. Oh, carry on, William. Yeah.
No, sorry, no questions.
Fine, sorry. Timothy, I think you can carry on for the rest of the report.
Right. So going through the rest of the report, I think in the rest of the report, we also included a decision that happened fairly recently, which happened at the last meeting, which was to just take advantage of Northern Trust, who are custodian. They have an ultra short fund, which also works a bit like a cash management fund. So we're now using that to just get a little bit more yield on our investments. So that was approved, and we're just in the process of setting that up. So just going on to page 20. On page 20, we highlight some of the key performance in Appendix 1 for the fund over the quarter. But as you can see, also goes back to the last 4 quarters as well. So you can see the performance. As you will see on the thing in March, there was a significant drop, mainly due to the global financial conditions around the COVID-19 fears. Since then, we've seen some of that recover, and the fund is actually now at an all-time high at 1.136. So that is quite good performance, but as usual, we just keep on monitoring the progress that's going on. If you look also at the liability section, you will see that the liability has increased, even though we've also increased our investments. And that's basically based on the actuaries' reducing their discount rate, because at this point, we expect that the performance that we've received over the last few years, especially when they made the triennial, would have changed. So we're anticipating that going forward, we're not going to get as much performance as we had before. So that lowers the discount rate, which means the liability goes up. So even though the fund at its triennial valuation was 100%, well, was close to 100% funded, it's now gone down to about 97%. So that just explains that change. Before I go to the ESG appendix, I'm happy to take any comments on anything on that, on Appendix 1 as well.
Timothy, I'm not sure if this was in Appendix 1, but I noted something when I was reading through about us holding 0 to 10 million in cash, yielding 40 to 50k.
Yeah.
And that had been questioned by somebody else, I think. And it does seem like a low yield for I'm assuming that, on average, we've got 5 million invested. So it seems like quite a risky thing for a fairly low return. Is that a sensible choice, do we think?
Yes, I think I'll just comment on the risk. The risk there isn't really much risk, because the way that this fund operates is similar to like a cash fund. So it's got daily dealing. So whenever we need to take the money out, if I put in a deal tomorrow, we'll be able to withdraw the money immediately. It'll give us about 2 days, but it's every day you can press that dealing. And then in terms of like the yield that we get at the moment, like it's next to 0. So that has an impact on our cash drag, especially when we're preparing to like make any big sizable movements, because sometimes we'll get big payments from our distributions, or we'll have some money sitting there whilst we're waiting to allocate it to a different manager. So whilst we have that money, it just is useful for us to have exposure to something that offers a bit more return for the funds. In terms of the risk, there isn't really much risk, because this is fairly liquid and it's fairly secure. And those balances actually average for about 3 to 4 to 6 months in the same level. So it's not usually we need to get that money out. But if we were to keep that money over a longer term or period, then you'd see that the difference would actually start to increase in terms of the interest. So I don't know whether that covers the question in terms of the risk.
Yeah, I understand that you necessarily need to hold large amounts of cash to facilitate the trading that you do. It's just, I thought that you'd need to, an event that happened 1 in 100 years, you're getting 1% or something return. So an event that happened once in 100 years where you lost a large amount of cash would upset that balance. And
yeah,
it would have to be really very, very rare, wouldn't it? Less than once in 100 years. And in the space of 100 years, significant financial upsets occur, I thought.
Yeah, I would say even if you think about the money that we have in there, because it's not an actual cash allocation for the fund, it's just the money that we have sitting in that fund for different reasons. So under normal circumstances, there probably wouldn't be any money in there, and we'll just be looking to sell other assets that we're currently invested in. But I think the view that we as officers took, and the one that committees took as well, is that we are doing very little for a bit extra. So in terms of like the overall risk, there isn't much change of the risk, because this is one of the safest in terms of bonds that you can get. And where in terms of the investment, because I think investment says it's double. Let me just check that it's correct. Yeah, so it's A and double A, which is investment grade really. So in terms of like the defaults, you'd be higher up. If there was to be a significant event, you'd be higher up, and the money that we have invested in that fund would be very minimum. But in the case that there isn't going to be any issues, the interest that we're getting in there is actually going to be helping the fund just make sure that we don't have as much of a cash drag on our performance.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else before we move on? No, in which case, Timothy, if you could take us through the appendices as appropriate.
Right, thank you, Chair. So just going on to the next appendix, which is the ESG update. Not really much has changed on this one, other than the performance this year. Actually, one thing that I did want to update is, as you can see, the assets are just under 45%, 50% are invested in low carbon assets. The investment that we made with the London Civs Global Sustain Fund actually is part of that equities number, which is about 500,000. And that is actually, in terms of like its carbon footprint, it's better than the low carbon, just because of the companies that it picks, and that includes in that strategy. So we've started to include that in this calculation as well. I think going forward, one of the things that we have been discussing with the committee is to include some sort of tracker that measures where we've come and where we are now, because we are mindful that there's been a few decisions that the committee has made which have significantly impacted the fund's footprint. So this is something that I would like to show as well. But at this point, I'm happy to take any comments on this page, any questions or anything that you feel might be useful for us to include when we update you in future meetings.
Yeah, Neil.
One of the, I mean, the court case earlier this year where the government obviously tried to stop local authority pension funds from being captured by all sorts of campaign bodies. I mean, what's the overall attitude of the pension fund subcommittee to that sort of external pressure?
I think, yeah, the pension fund subcommittee gets regular updates and advice from its investors and from its advisors and officers. And the main thing is really the fiduciary responsibility for them is for the members in the pension fund. So anything that we're doing, and I think I'll touch on it when I get to the responsible investment stuff, is literally looking at the long-term objectives of the fund, not necessarily what the campaign groups are looking to do. So I think if our strategy should not really be based on different campaign groups, but should be more based on what does the investments actually impact the members. And this is something that the pension fund is taking quite seriously. That's why you develop an investment strategy statement, because it provides a vision of what you're looking to do, and then you're able to then work with that when you're looking at new investments and new areas to go into. So I think, yeah, we definitely have we're starting to build up on a plan. And hopefully that plan will make sure that the investments are always in the context of the members. I don't know if that's, yeah.
Thanks, Timothy. Yeah, if you want to, I don't think there are any further questions on that if you want to move on.
Okay, so moving on, let me just check. So I think moving on, I don't really have anything else to highlight on the quarterly updates. So unless there are anything specific that anyone wanted to discuss, I'm happy to move on to the next item, if that's all right, Chair.
Yeah, sorry, just to check if there's any questions on the rest of it. I might just ask you to make a bit of a comment on the risk register, but we'll see if anyone else has got any. Okay. Timothy, in which case, I wonder if you could just, so the risk register is pretty clear in that you've now sort of looked at impact and come with the total and multiplied it by likelihood and then thought about mitigants. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit, so I can understand what's going on there. I wonder if you could just briefly sort of say something about some of what you see as higher risk elements on the risk register at the moment. Clearly, COVID-19 is right at the top there, and some of the investment issues that are around that are coming up, and there's like uncertainty of UK's withdrawal from the EU, for example. Yeah. I wonder if you could just comment on a few of those higher risk elements, and obviously some of them, as you've noted here, have been sort of mitigated, but they still remain relatively high risk. Are you seeing any of them sort of crystallise in practice?
Yeah, so yes, I suppose the first thing, just to highlight a few of the risks, I think you've touched on a few of them on the investment side. We are concerned about the COVID-19 and what impact that has, not only in the immediate term, but long term. So that's why these are some of the reasons why the pension fund has decided to invest, for example, in an active manager in equities, rather than just passive, because with an active, especially in this time where you've got like volatility in the markets, active managers tend to do well. So we're seeing that the performance that we're actually getting from our new active managers is quite good compared to the general market. And then another main thing that we're also concerned about, I think, was mentioned in the MNG portfolio in terms of like the property allocation. We're quite concerned about the property allocation, but we still want to be allocated to inflation, because that is one risk that's not quite apparent in this sector, but that's a risk that we feel is quite coming in strongly. You see in the central banks, they've got like a strong sort of will to make sure that the spending keeps on going up, and you've got all the stimulus coming in from the different governments across the world. So this is something that the committee, as well as the officers, we're looking into, to seeing how can we be positioned. So when we get out of the when we start to see the recovery from the COVID-19 virus, we're adequately positioned. And then there are obviously concerns about what's going to happen with Brexit. At this moment, we're not too sure, so we're not really looking to speculate. But as most of our investments are invested globally, that doesn't have much of an impact on us directly. But of course, we do live in the UK, so that's something we do monitor on a regular basis. And then I suppose those are really the main ones on the investment side. And the reason why I suppose they remain high is even though we're doing mitigating option, we're not really in control of some of the factors. So we can only do so much to reduce that risk, but that risk still remains. What we do over the course of the time now is to just review those risks. And as we see like the risk are lowering, especially when you're seeing like maybe the vaccine coming in, then that will have an impact that will lower the overall risk. And our mitigating also will be in line with what's happening generally within the market. So some of those, as you can see, they have dropped because of the work that we've done, but we can't minimize them to zero because unfortunately, we don't really know what's going to happen at least in the short term. But long term, we're always looking to make sure that these risks and the actions that we're taking in are actually protecting us for the next few years. And then on the admin one, the one that we just raised, which is the main risk, is on the changing of salary, which you've obviously been involved in the conversation just earlier on today, and that's basically about the how we're going to be obviously migrating all the data to the new providers, how quickly they're going to be implementing, and the retained service also coming in-house. That poses its own risk. But again, I think there's a lot of work that's being done by those teams to actually make sure that we are adequately risk. So that's something that going forward, we'll be looking to work closely with the admin team as well, especially the in-house at Hammersmith, to ensure that when we're updating some of these admin risks, they are also able to put in their input, and hopefully you can have them much lower on our risk register.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there are any more questions on that item, as far as I can see. So thanks for that one, Timothy. Just before we go on, do we agree the recommendation to note the report? Those members who are on camera can nod.
Yes, agreed. Thank you.
Agreed.
Agreed.
That's great, thank you. So item 6 is the draft annual report. Timothy, can we come back to you to introduce this item?
Yes, thank you, Chair, again. So yeah, the annual report, I think members have already sort of alluded to some of the content in it. So we don't really have anything specific to direct you towards, but if there are any areas that you'd like us to go into more details and explain, then we'll be happy to do that on the course of this meeting. The only thing I'd like to reference is that normally under normal circumstances, we would have already received this report. This report would have already been published and would have come to, you'll probably be seeing the report sort of in a published version. But unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 response again, the MSCOG has actually extended the deadline to the 30th of November. So we are in the process of finalizing the audit with our auditors. And the subcommittee at its last meeting actually delegated the authority to officers to publish once the audit was complete. So I think we're probably looking for a couple of weeks. I think we're on time to achieve that deadline. So there isn't any particular area to raise that as a risk. But like I mentioned, if there are any areas that you may have picked up on whilst you're reading or preparing the documents, I'm happy to just expand further.
Neil, yeah.
I mean, this is not the year to do it for obvious reasons, but we've spoken previously about, this is not an easy read unless you're a bit of a nerd, to be honest. And we need a Janet and John summary for the average pensioner that needs to go out, once a year with, this is what we do about investments, this is what we do about ESG, these are our key performance indicators on the admin and so on. A simple page stuff with references and links to the wider report. But I agree, you haven't got time this year.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a good point. It's something that, we'd look to explore. The reason why I suppose the annual report is so big is there are a lot of statutory requirements that should be included in the annual report. So we have to include stuff like obviously our accounts, they take up a massive amount of that, some analysis on the admin performance, and some risk factors. And there's also a few appendices as well, like on communications and on overall strategy. So I think some of those documents are standalone documents. They are available elsewhere already, but we sort of include them in there. So that's something we can explore if you think that would be quite useful. Just a summary maybe for pension board alongside this reporting. I think that would be quite useful.
Are there any other questions, Bora or William?
Not as such, but I just wondered, Neil's point there, was it that the report in a very short form might go out to pension members rather than just to the board? Was that part of the thinking? Because that seems like quite a good idea.
Yeah, I think we would have to explore how we can sort of pull that out, and it probably wouldn't go out as an annual report, because to call it an annual report, you have to include all the different elements in it. But if it's something that's useful to go to members just to explain, I think that's some of the work we're trying to do with the responsible investment statement, for example, which I'll get to on later, is trying to highlight some of that and put some case studies in a way that it's simple to digest the information. But for an annual report, just because of the requirements that are involved, might be difficult. But what we can provide is a summary on the performance of the fund, particularly on responsible investment, which is a key part of the fund right now. That's something definitely I think we'll be able to implement and share with members as well, and put it on the website.
That sounds good. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Timothy. I should say, I did actually, I know, take Neil's point about this being largely for nerds, perhaps, but one thing that was interesting that I hadn't noticed before is it has got a list of the lists of contributing employers, admitted bodies and scheduled bodies, and their contributions throughout the year. So it does give a good overview of exactly which are the members of the scheme that we're looking at, and clearly that's a lot of the primary schools and secondary schools in the borough in particular. And then there are some other third parties who seem to be there as admitted bodies. I don't know whether it's worth asking this question now, but certainly on the admitted bodies, well, maybe a very quick answer is some of them clearly, and coming back to Neil's point earlier, are only making relatively small contributions, which does suggest that they've only got a relatively few members of staff for whom they're contributing, and there may be some costs involved in that. I don't know whether you can sort of just say anything about that, because clearly we do a lot of admitted bodies, but they don't seem to contribute a great deal, which suggests that they're not contributing in respect of too many members of staff. But I wonder if you're able to comment on what the arrangements are there.
Yeah, so in terms of the contributions, it will be relative to how many members they have within the actual the body. So yeah, some of them with very few, it might be just one member, or there might be 3 or 4, because most of them are doing contracted services that fall under the LGPS scheme. Just, I suppose, in terms of like their contribution will be relevant to the amount of assets that they also have in the fund. So for example, with Hammersmith and Fulham Council, which is the main fund, that will be about 80% of the fund, and the assets and the performance would be attributable to the to Hammersmith and Fulham. And same with these bodies. And some of the bodies, as you see, some of them, they might be quite in terms of turnaround. And I think this is something that the admin team can probably comment on a bit better than I can. But there's a lot of like turnaround in terms of like the employers we have. So sometimes in between valuations, you have new admitted bodies, and they'll also have a leave. When they leave, they also get the cessation forms, which would be a portion of how much based on how they've contributed. So I suppose if the analogy was, are they just getting like a free ride? No, their performance is relative to their members, and it's basically about the member contribution, and then the body also supports the member in terms of like supporting that contribution. So I mean, some of the work that we don't really do a lot of extensive work for some of our admitted bodies. For example, with our scheduled bodies, we do FRS 102 reports, which is basically an annual report of their valuation. So, and when we do that work, we obviously charge them for that work, so that is refunded back into the pension fund. With our admitted bodies, there isn't that level of work on a regular basis for all of them. There are some of the big ones like 3BM. We do that at the same time we do our annual accounts for Hammersmith and Fulham. So it's varied, but I suppose the bigger you are within the scheme, the more services you probably would get from the actual teams, and the smaller schemes just tend to be not as difficult in managing.
No, thank you very much. I don't think there are any further questions. So can I just ask that we agree the recommendation to note the report?
Agreed. Thank you.
Agreed.
That's lovely. Thank you. I think it's back to you, Timothy, to introduce item 7, which is the responsible investment statement. And I think Matt Dawson is here as well. Maybe Matt's going to speak first. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to take this one, Chair, as well. So yeah, basically we are introducing in this item 7, we're introducing the responsible investment statement. So I think earlier on this year, when we had our first meeting, we did present you this responsible investment form in draft form. And I appreciate that it will look very different to the policy that we presented at that moment in time. What happened is, subsequent to that meeting, we then met with the Pension Fund Committee, and we took on the views that we both received from the Pensions Board and the Pensions Committee, and there was a lot of changes that they liked. I think one of the comments is kind of echoing what Neil was saying about making it easy to read. You don't want it to be just a policy document that no one's going to refer to, and also being able to highlight some of the work that the fund has been doing so far. So just in the first section on the appendix, just taking you through the document now, I think it's on page 229. We have outlined what we see as the key priorities for the fund over the next few years, and this is just in a responsible investment context. So the first one is investing towards a sustainable future. So as discussed earlier, we've talked about how we're investing towards more low carbon funds, but we're also looking at like some of our allocations. So part of this discussion in residential investment, for example, will involve some of the social impact that we can find from those sort of strategies. So one of the strategies that I know is under consideration right now is social housing, which would have a social impact for a lot of people, especially who've got needs, and it also provides a saving for councils who normally tend to take on those services. So in terms of like how we're investing, we look at the investment strategy, then we go on to look at how we can implement that in a responsible way. A key part of having a responsible strategy is to actually measure the impact of the investments. So that's the point number 2. And I think over the last few years, we've made quite a reasonable amount of progress in terms of how we measure, but we still have a long way to go. So this is something that we're continually looking to find out new ways of how we can report this and what might be relevant information for stakeholders, for board to make decisions on, for the committees as well. And then the final point is on the wider engagement with the investment community. So this is something that as officers, we've already been sort of trying to do. We work quite closely with the investment pool, London SIF, in setting up some of their new investment funds. I know they're looking at like setting up some funds in renewable investment. We are having those conversations just to try and make sure that the mandate that they have on there would be appropriate for us should we wish to get involved in investing in that strategy. So just taking you through the rest of the report, really. I think what we've actually added to this report, which I think would be quite useful, but again, I'm happy to take any feedback on this, is we put in a couple investment case studies, and we got this directly from our investment managers. So we sent them questions, we asked them, what are you doing in terms of like, in terms of the environment, in terms of like the social, is there any information you give to us that we'll be able to share with our members? So we've got quite a good example from one of our Viva investments, which also like uses energy from waste, which has been doing quite well in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. And then on page 231, we've also included our own carbon sort of investment case study on the carbon performance of the fund. And we've used the metric, which is the carbon to value investment, which measures each element of the carbon output for the portfolio based on the amount that we invested in it. And for us as asset owners, that's sort of the most relevant way of us measuring and tracking it. And you see that there was a drop in December 2019, and that was an intentional decision based on when we divested from the UK equity fund and went into the MSCI carbon. Now, we'll obviously be looking to update this a bit further and see what will be the impact of us now being in the Morgan Stanley fund instead, or the London Global Sustain Fund. So this is something that I think it's sort of the early initial ways of us seeing how we can communicate our responsible investment statement, but also starting to put some metrics out there that we can reliably measure and monitor our progress going forward. So just to mention that this document was presented at the last meeting and the committee has approved it. So for this year, this is the document that we'll be referring to for any responsible investment decisions. But this is not where the work ends. We'll be looking next year to see how we can sort of update this and do this better. So I think now is a good time to start taking those views on some things that you might feel are lacking in this particular document, and then we'll start looking at how we can incorporate them into future years in terms of like the improvement on our responsible investment for the fund. So at this point, I'm just happy to open it up to discussion and welcome any thoughts, comments, or questions.
Are there any comments? from members of the committee?
I suppose I'd just say that I wonder at our ability to measure, carbon to pounds invested. And it's difficult to do that with a supplier that you buy, electricity from. I wonder how on earth we can do it with these big investment companies. But,
right. So, yeah, just I suppose to just give a bit of context as to how those numbers come about. There is quite a lot of work that happens within the investment sector in terms of the allocation. I think over the next few years, we'll see this reporting continue to improve. There is a disclosure process. I don't know if any of you would have picked this up in the news a couple of weeks ago, where the Chancellor actually mentioned about the task force on climate-related disclosures, which is something they want to be mandatory across all companies. Basically, all companies would have to report on what their carbon footprint is, and that will happen by 2022, 2023. So there's already a lot of work that's going on in the background in terms of like how they are starting to measure this. And I'm sure over the next few years, you start to see that you can go to your supplier and they'll be able to tell you how much carbon footprint it is or how much their company is generating. The way that it's currently measured is not standardized. So that does make it very difficult to come up with those easy to say, this is, your carbon footprint is this number, because there isn't a standard level of sort of measuring it. But there are sort of different levels, like Scope 1, which is directly measured. So you can measure that for a lot of the oil companies, for example. It's basically how much they're drilling out. You can do the estimations based on their activity and their business activity. But there's also like Scope 2, which is further down the supply chain. And then Scope 3 is the most difficult one, which is you as the end user using the product. It's very difficult to measure that. And one of the, I suppose, the difficulties is in avoiding the double counting, because some of the Scope 3 measurements are already included in Scope 1 and Scope 2. So I think it's very much difficult at this point. And one thing I'd probably just caution is, in as much as we've made quite a good progress in measuring this is probably subject to change once the reporting quality gets better. And that measure that we have is only on the equities aspect of the portfolio. Once you start looking at fixed income, it gets even more difficult to do it. And if you start looking at like the renewable side of things as well, it's much more difficult, because renewables are more about the output rather than reducing the carbon. So I think what we're doing is just trying to make a good stab at it, have some sort of sense of direction based on the information that we have. And then going forward, we'll be looking to see, as this reporting improves, how can we incorporate that into our overall investment and our overall strategies. So I think that's the point where we are right now. But yeah, I do take your point. It's a very difficult job to do.
Thank you. We won't be too surprised if the numbers shift as it evolves then.
Yes, definitely. I would expect them to shift.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Timothy. Sorry, I can't see any further questions on this item. Thank you for introducing it. But do members agree to note the report?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Timothy. I think we now move on to item 8, which is the Supreme Court decision on the LGPS investment guidance. And is that going to be?
This will be myself, Chair.
Yeah, sorry.
Chair, before you start, apologies for joining late. I've also got to leave early. One of the problems with living out in the sticks is that, our broadband speeds aren't too clever, and I've now got a parish council meeting. So apologies, I've got to go.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much for attending tonight, Neil. We'll speak to you again at the next meeting. Okay,
Take
care. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.
Great. Sorry, I think, Matt, it looks like you're introducing this.
That's right, yeah. I think everyone on this meeting knows me. If you don't, I'm Matt Dawson. So I'm primarily a Treasury officer at the Tri-Borough, but I do have a governance hat that I wear across all three funds. I did do Tim's job in a prior life, so that was interesting to hear all that back. So in regard to the Supreme Court decision, that was something that Mr. Newton actually raised earlier in this meeting. So very much an information only as far as the board's concerned on something that's now been enacted. To give some context, this was the Palestine Solidarity Campaign who brought a case for the enablement of LGPS funds to divest from certain Israeli companies that they sought to be violating human rights. And it concerns LGPS funds that had put embargoes and restrictions on their investment strategy based on non-financial factors. Now, the government had initially stated that this was an inappropriate use of power, and moreover that funds are not permitted to invest contrary to UK foreign policy. So this made it through the court system all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it ended up being a majority of 3-2 that actually overruled the decision made by the previous courts and decided that administering authorities do have the powers to implement their own policies. So at 2.3, if you want to get into the body of the report, you'll see two words in block capitals, which are how and what, which was really key, because this was what Lord Wilson saw as: how are you going to approach these restrictions and what are you proposing to exclude? So there's really potential consideration. We've just gone through Tim's responsible investment statement for the fund. In future incarnations of that, this might be something to consider. The key message, though, for me that came from Lord Wilson was something I've always supported, is that the pension fund assets aren't actually public money. Enough public money goes into the fund, but it's often reported in the press as public money, but the fund is actually a reserve held as deferred pay to pay out to members on retirement. So that was the distinction, in that we aren't dealing with public money. Now, what we don't know is the government's response to this. And it's thought that there could be further legislation put in place to override parts of this in possibly a set of new investment regulations, which would overrule. And so it's very much a work in progress. We don't know what the government are going to do. So it's one to keep an eye on, one I'm certainly going to periodically bring back to the board, because it is a very interesting and topical item, and I'm pleased a member of the board raised it this evening. I'll pause there for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you. William or Bora, do you have any questions?
I don't. It's a very interesting event, isn't it? But no questions.
Yeah, none from me, thank you.
Yeah, similarly, thank you for explaining that, Matt. I think it's sort of self-explanatory. I'm not sure we need to go any further into it. So can we just agree to note the reports, William and Bora?
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. So moving on, if we go to item 9, which is the LGPS McLeod consultation, and I think, Matt, is that for you to introduce?
It's also me, Chair, yes. Yeah. Okay, yes, I'll introduce this. So this item almost made it to the Supreme Court, but the government conceded defeat before it got there. So this might be something that the board is already familiar with. Essentially, there was a case brought forward by a High Court judge called MacLeod and a firefighter named Sargent. And it was as a result of the review of public sector pension schemes, and in particular for the LGPS in 2014, when final salary became career average. So this is something that will affect all active members at that time and in the future. Now, it's really not unusual to see reformations in the LGPS. If I think about myself, so I've been a member of the LGPS since 1997. So I have pre-2008 service in one scheme. I then from 2008 to 2014, I'm accruing in another scheme. They're both final salary, and from 2014, it's career average. So for every year, it's a 49th of my pay, which is then frozen at the end of the year and inflation linked. So very different scheme. And the formulas is relatively complex, but it's knowable. If you sit down and crunch the numbers, it makes sense. The issue with the 2014 scheme was that there was a 10-year tapering period from 2012 to 2022 as a protection. So if you were within 10 years of retirement at 2012, the change from final salary to career average, depending on when you retired, you would have, depending on the timeline, of course, you would have a degree of protection, so that the change from final salary to career average wouldn't impact the individual so severely, dependent on your service and your salary. That tapering period was challenged and found to be age discriminatory and therefore deemed to be unlawful. So this item, and in particular the appendix, is the government's solution to repair that taper and to remove the associated age discrimination. Now, the people that can fully understand this in its current form are probably about the same amount of people that are attending this meeting. I mean, this has literally taken the best actuaries and the best industry experts 2 years to solve. It's that complex. There is a proposed underpin where every case of retirement would be revisited on an individual basis to ensure the best outcome for that person. This isn't a finalised document. There will be following this document a government statutory instrument to implement the new way of working. But for me, for all its complexities, it's a simple question, and simple questions often have the most complex answers. But the question is, would you have been better off with the taper on your calculated final salary pension than you are on the calculated average benefit on career average? So if the difference on final salary is higher than the new, if final salary beats career average, it's up to the pension fund to make up that difference. Now, from a funding perspective, it's been accounted for in IS 19 and valuations. It's a limited impact in funding level, and if I talk to people in the industry, and Tim might be able to help here, it's far more of an administrative issue and far more of a resources issue, and getting this correct rather than an impact on the fund. So it's more of it's more workload rather than anything that could harm the funding level. That was all I was going to cover there, Chair. So I'll pause for questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think that thank you for that explanation. I think that all of us were actually at the training session a couple of weeks ago, when I think this was explained in some more detail. So I think that was I should just comment, I thought that was a very good training session. So thank you to you and others who helped to arrange it. So I think we probably helpfully covered a lot of the details there. So, but thank you for bringing it to this meeting. But that said, Bora or William, do you have any questions that you want to ask about this?
No, not from me, thank you.
No, I thought that was very clearly explained, Matthew. Thank you.
Thanks. I guess, I mean, obviously, just as one comment, obviously, this is presumably something that, as you say, Matt, is going to be an administrative issue, particularly to actually, as you say, trying to actually do the calculations to ensure that you give the scheme member the higher of the two, if one is, particularly if the final salary amount is.
Yes, absolutely, Chair. Yeah,
so I guess that comes back to earlier discussion tonight, which is about ensuring that our scheme administrators going forward have the ability to do that calculation, given the resources.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a myriad of complications. There's breaks in service, deferred, early retirements, ill health. There are so many ways of dealing with this. So it's very complex.
Excellent. So just on that one, can we, William and Bora, agree to note the report, which I think is the recommendation?
Yes.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Thank you for noting the report. I mean, the only other thing to note is that there's another training session which I hope we'll be able to attend, which is, I think, a week on Tuesday, the 3rd of December. So thanks again to those who've put that on. Can I just say, I think that concludes the business of tonight's meeting, and Rita will jump in hopefully if. Sorry, Matt, did you want to?
So, Chair, can I just skip? I mean, I'm absolutely delighted of the board's attendance to the training event. If I could just make one point, I hope you join us all for the December session. I am planning on one further session in February, purely on risk management, because risk as board members, risk management is actually a key topic. So yeah, I'd be great to see you all in December. We are planning on recording every session, so in the event that you can't attend, they should all be available and recorded. So yeah, so it'll be 2 more sessions this year.
Okay, no, thank you very much for letting us know about that, Matt. Can I thank all of the officers, Matt, Timothy, and David and Amrita for all of their work tonight, and all of the officers who joined us earlier. Thank you for all of the updates, and we will doubtless be back in due course for another pensions board meeting. I guess it will be next year now. So thank you for all your attendance at tonight's meeting, and I can declare the meeting closed.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, Chair.